Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sisotris, and this week I wanted to talk about marketing genres, specifically young adult. So, book marketing is beset by a number of labels that aren't exactly all that clear, but serve more to help consumers find big sections in bookstores rather than be really specific about what they're actually finding there. And one of these that causes sort of the most consternation is the label young adult. So if you go online and you're looking up lists of like best young adult books, you're going to sometimes find books that don't fit in the genre. You're going to find things like Percy Jackson or Jane Austen. And neither of those fit into young adult, but it just kind of shows how unclear the age range is for young adult, especially recently, because things have been happening that are causing it to feel more like it's a subset of adult fiction rather than young adult fiction. So first off, young adult is a category, it's not a genre. So it can contain many different genres within that category. You can have horror, you can have romance, you can have action adventure, you can have drama, anything like that. Young adult can also feature things like drug use and cursing and sexual situations, but they should always be appropriate for a young adult audience. So let's talk the age range. The age range for young adult is usually between like the ages of 12 and 17. That's usually the ages of the characters who are in the books, and that's also the ages that the books are targeted at. Now there are other books that are adult books that feature characters who fit into that age range that aren't considered young adult. One good example would be the book It by Stephen King. Half of the book is set when all the characters are younger. And so that's why a lot of people, before young adult was easy to find, went to that book because it featured kids their own age. And they are dealing with things that kids deal with, things like growing up and bullying and, all that kind of stuff. But the book is an adult book that is meant to look back at childhood. It's all about sort of the effect that our childhood experiences have on us as adults looking back at that. So there's kind of a nostalgia built into that book. And so, a teenager can read it and enjoy it, but the book is aimed at adults. So even though it features teenagers, it's not necessarily marketed to teenagers specifically. Young adult books are often about things that are relevant to teenagers specifically. So concepts of coming up with your own sense of identity, the transition from childhood to adulthood, the desire to have more independence, all those kinds of things, those are all very much hallmarks of YA books, and that's the things that the characters are specifically dealing with and overcoming and struggling with. You get lots of things like issues of self-image, issues of like insecurities, fear about moving into adult spaces, feeling unwelcome in adult spaces but still not feeling like a child, that concept of feeling trapped within worlds. All of those factor into YA. So looking at the two examples I mentioned earlier, Percy Jackson is a middle grade series. It's aimed at younger readers, maybe between the ages of like 9 and 12. That's where you get books like, I'm thinking of what I read. I'm thinking of things like My Teacher Fried My Brains or Animorph, stuff like that. These are books that are aimed at younger readers, and they might go into more adult things. His Dark Materials is another good example. It's technically a middle grade series, but by the end of it, the characters are, I think, like 13, 14, so it is kind of edging into that young adult age range. But the books are mostly about being a child and living in a world where everything is sort of almost too big to deal with. In young adult books, you still have that sense of like feeling too young to really help things, but you're smart enough at that age to start thinking about how you could fix things if you were able to. Teenagers are able to start thinking about the future in a way that children usually don't. With kids, it's all about how can we get back to the status quo. Think about like The Wizard of Oz. You've got Dorothy, She has all these adventures, but all she really wants is to go back to her home and her family. Even though Oz is this marvelous, wonderful place with people there who are fun and helpful to her in different ways, she does want to go back to where she started, because children's books are all about how can we fix the crazy thing that's happening and return it to the status quo. Percy Jackson, there is some growth, and it does sort of, when you get to the end of the series, especially the continuation as it goes on, it does sort of move into that kind of YA age range. But if you're looking at the original 5 books, it's very much about how can we stop this chaotic thing from happening so that we can go back to living our lives like normal. Whereas young adult is always about forging a new life, finding a new way that you relate to the world, fitting into things that you didn't previously fit into. So it's about discovering things about yourself, discovering things about the world, and moving into a new way of looking at the world that's different from when they were a child. So the young adults books are often about sort of the transition between childhood and adulthood. Some great examples, The Hunger Games is a good one. That one is very much a metaphor, among other things, but it's a metaphor for sort of the concept of when you get to a certain age, you start to realize how unjust the world can be, and you want to fix things. You've got this sense of, I'm finally old enough to start thinking about how I can affect the world around me, and so I want to make things better, and the struggles that come from that. Young adult books often have sort of situations where the children, or like the teenagers, have to sort of grow up faster than they normally would. They have to take charge in a way that they normally wouldn't do, because they have to sort of protect their family, or they lose their family and they have to strike out on their own, or their family is there but they aren't able to help for some reason. It's all about sort of, you know, their first experience with autonomy, with sort of being their own person, having to face their problems by themselves, and how scary that can be. I couldn't get through a talk about YA without talking about Twilight. You can make fun of it all you want. I actually genuinely love this series. But this is another one. It's a good metaphor for sort of all of the tempestuous things that come from, you know, moving into adulthood and being sort of scared of what you might find when you know, become an adult. A big through line of the series is this sort of desire for intimacy, but being afraid of it, being insecure about your own self, about what you might bring to it, going into a relationship for the first time and having no clue what you're doing, because when we were all teenagers, we had no clue what we were doing, and relationships felt like they were the be-all, end-all, when in reality, looking back, a lot of them were just sort of us figuring ourselves out. And I think these books genuinely do portray that really well. There's this desire to sort of grow up really fast and have sort of the relationship and then get married and kind of reach that sort of adult milestone. And all the while you've got characters, you know, kind of holding the main character back and saying, you don't actually want this, you don't really want this. And it is about, you know, her wanting to be a vampire, and also her, you know, meeting someone else who's a shapeshifter, and maybe she wants that as well. She can't decide. It's all about kind of wanting to move into that next stage in your life, and the delayed gratification that comes from kind of holding off, because you do still want to be a kid, but you do want to grow up, but growing up is scary. And that's very much what these are about. Now, there is a lot of religious morality sort of baked into this, and, you know, you don't have to sort of listen to that. But the whole, like, the concept of wanting to be intimate with someone, but being afraid of it, and knowing that it might change you forever if you do, that's very much something that teenagers can relate to, because you've got all these feelings and you can't really make sense of them at that age. And these books are annoying to read at sometimes as an adult, because you're just like, God, can't you see, you know, you think you want this, but you don't really, you know, you can still be a kid, you can still enjoy life, you don't have to grow up so fast. But when you're a teenager, you want nothing more than to stop being a kid and to grow up as fast as possible. And I think these books deal with that paradox very well. Legendborn is another wonderful one. There's 2 books in that series out, and there's a 3rd one on the way. That one is very much aimed at sort of minority teenagers and becoming aware of how systemic racism and systemic oppression is built into a lot of the big systems, and sort of walking the line between how much do you want to participate in this to benefit from it, and also how much do you want to speak out against it because you can see that it's unjust. And Legendborn does that really, really well, because you've got this order that's based on like Arthurian legend, and the main character Bree really wants to be a part of it, and she discovers that she's connected to it in a really big way, but she also has kind of a connection to sort of her ancestral magic that comes from her family and her culture, and the worldviews are very difficult to reconcile because there's sort of 2 different ways of looking at how to work with this magic, and one is based on sort of a colonizing perspective, and one is based on a mutual respect with those powers that you don't see in the other one. And so Legendborn is a really great example of sort of when you're a kid and you become aware of systemic racism and the way that different people are treated and the way that some people have more privilege than others, and becoming aware of that and finding yourself conflicted because you're like, I want to be a part of this, but is this going to help me the way it's going to help other people, and being aware of privilege and all that. So Legendborn is a really fantastic example of that. Ember in the Ashes is another really good YA series. It's brutal and it's violent, and it's very much kind of looking at this idea of when you're a teenager, you look at the news and everything just feels hopeless and terrible, and people are mistreated, and there's genocides happening, and there's wars happening, and you think, how am I gonna, survive if the future isn't even there? How is the future even going to be something that we should work for? And so it's all about sort of turning that rage at the unfairness of everything and the violence and the uncertainty, and forging a path, surviving, standing up for what's right, and changing things for the better so that there is a future that you can actually look forward to. And I think a lot of YA books also speak to a lot of the insecurities of young people who are finding that the future isn't really guaranteed. A long time ago, it was sort of assumed that you grow up, you go to school, you maybe go to college, you get a degree, you get a good job, and then you get a house and a family, and then you just sort of do what everyone else is doing, and that's sort of assumed, provided, you have certain privileges that allow that to be possible. But now there's a lot of insecurity, and there's a lot of fear for the future, and fear of how you'll fit into a world that's changing so fast, and technology's changing, and the social norms are changing, people are becoming more open about things, cultural attitudes towards certain people are changing, there's a lot of introspection about baked in systemic prejudices and how to overcome those. And that's great, but it can be really overwhelming and scary to sort of teenagers who are wanting to be an adult, but knowing that being an adult isn't all it's cracked up to be in the world today for some people. And so for something to be YA, it really speaks to teenagers in that specific sense. I recently read Demon Copperhead, and the main character in that one is a teenager for a big part of it, but it's not marketed to teenagers. It's marketed to adults who are looking at their past and looking at the decisions that they made that brought them here, and sort of giving them hope for the future. Teenagers could read it, especially, when he's younger, and they can relate to the struggles that the main character's going through, but the book isn't really necessarily aimed at teenagers. It's dealing with sort of adult insecurities and adult struggles, but it's seen through the mind of a child to give adults a different perspective. So that book is aimed at adults. Teenagers can read it and understand it, but the book is aimed at adults. YA books are aimed specifically at teenagers. Now, lately, we've seen kind of a shift in terms of who YA is marketed towards, because you saw sort of audiences broadening out and meshing over. Now, I have read YA stuff. My favorite books are adult books, but I do have a couple YA series that I do keep up with because I enjoy the writing and I enjoy the characters and all that. But there's certain things, like the Twilight books were very famously popular with sort of grown moms who were reading sort of the books that their teen girls were reading, and they fell in love with the storytelling. I like Twilight too, and so I understand that, being an adult and wanting to sort of laugh at the chaos of being a teenager and being positive that you know everything and knowing exactly what you want in life and sort of being like, sure, yeah, okay, that's nice. It's melodramatic, they're fun, I enjoy reading them. But because they became so popular with adults, there was a marketing shift, and there were actually editions of Twilight that were sort of marketed at adults with sort of different cover art, and it just became sort of normal for adults to read YA. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it got to the point where many adults thought that YA was for them specifically, and that YA books were made for adults. And so you get sort of weird expectations. I know Sarah J. Maas's ACOTAR books, there's a cat here, they sort of start out YA, but then the books get more adult as they go on. And it kind of created this misconception where you have people expecting YA to be synonymous with like dark adult romance. And there's nothing wrong with dark adult romance. I enjoy it personally, but they're not meant to be that level of sort of explicit and adult. You can have books aimed at teenagers that deal with sex and topics about that. Judy Blume was really good at that. She would write about topics that were relevant to teenagers who were, just getting into that kind of thing, being uncertain about who they were, relationships, all that. And she addressed it in a very age-appropriate way. It wasn't offensive, even though a lot of people try to ban Judy Blume from school libraries, and I think she is banned in a couple school libraries, here and there. She was writing for teenage readers, and she did it in a really good way that was sort of meeting them at their level, but it wasn't just like explicit romance just for the sake of romance. It was dealing with things that kids deal with when they're kind of going through adolescence. And so there's this assumption now a lot of times when people will say, oh, I have a new YA book coming out, and people will say, well, how spicy is it? And that just misses the point entirely. It's like they're not meant to be sort of dark, explicit romance. You can have YA books that are romances, of course. Twilight's a good example of that. But you don't want to market teenage books to adults. And also, I don't really understand why adults want to read explicit sex scenes featuring teenagers. That doesn't feel right. But again, a lot of these books are sometimes marketed as YA, but the characters are like 18 to 20. So it's a little bit different. So I think there's this confusion at this point over sort of what YA means. But YA is aimed at readers between the ages of like 12 and 17-ish. There is a new adult category that is trying to kind of be a thing, but it's not really sticking, where it's sort of aimed at sort of 18 to 22, that kind of age range. But honestly, it just feels like at that point you can just read adult stuff. If you're old enough, there's plenty of adult books that will appeal to people of that age. So it's a whole big thing. So YA, I think, should stay aimed at teenagers, and it should be about teenagers, about the things that they go through. And then there should be adult books that are aimed at adults and about things that adults do and deal with. And that's fine. There's plenty of adult romance that is fun and features fantasy and horror elements even, and it can be comedy, it can be contemporary. There's so much romance romance is a wonderful genre that I don't understand why adults are wanting to kind of take over the YA space as well, because romance is a massive category. I've talked about it in previous videos. So YA is very much for teenagers, about teenagers, and adults can read it, and teenagers can read adult books, and that's fine, but there should still be that sort of separation, because teenagers deserve a space where they can read books about them and have it not be marketed towards adults. They should have books that are for them. Because when I was younger, it was really hard to find YA books. Now, they existed for sure, but they weren't marketed the way they are today. And so there were books that I could have read when I was a teenager, but there was a couple different reasons why I never really found them. The first was they were all sort of kept in the children's section in like the library. They were all squashed together. So you had everything from like little kids to YA stuff, and it was all sort of in one section. And when you're a teenager in your mind, you're like, oh, well, that's the kids section. I don't want to read kids books. And teachers, I think, weren't super well informed about this. Maybe some were, but I know the only real YA book that I ever heard about was S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders. And other than that, there was really no books that I was ever told about. No one my age read them. There were quite a few books that were aimed at like teen girls, and those were really popular, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's totally fine. But for teen boys, there really wasn't a lot that was specifically marketed for them. There was kind of the middle grade books that went up into the YA section. I'm thinking of the series My Teacher is an Alien. The first few books are just like middle grade sci-fi shenanigans. My Teacher's an Alien, My Teacher Fried My Brains, My Teacher Glows in the Dark. That was my favorite because he gets to go to space and he lives on this huge spaceship and meets all these aliens and stuff. And it's great. I loved it. And then the fourth book felt more like a YA book, because that one, all the aliens gather all these kids together and they say, all right, we've decided that Earth is no longer worth saving because people on it are so awful. So we're going to destroy the planet. And the kids sort of say, let us prove to you that Earth is worth saving. Like, this is heavy stuff. And they travel down to Earth and try to find examples of like human kindness and stuff that would give them sort of faith for the future that Earth was worth saving. And it was fantastic. It was so well written, really emotional, really deep. That book felt more like YA. I think it's still technically considered middle grade, but there was a maturity there, and there was a responsibility on the part of the kids that it really felt more like YA. But that was really the only book that I had heard of. So most kids my age, men and women, when we were sort of teenagers, the YA stuff, like teachers weren't talking about it as much. And so a lot of us jumped right from middle grade right to adult. I went from like Animorphs to like Michael Crichton, Tom Clancy, and Anne Rice, which way too adult for me at that age, but I started reading it. Other kids my age were reading like Stephen King and V.C. Andrews at that age too. I mean, these are like 13-year-old kids who are reading really adult stuff because we wanted to read, we were desperate to read, but the teachers around us didn't really know of any books that were sort of age appropriate, and so they just said, here, you can read this. Thankfully, a lot of us had parents who were okay with us reading things that were sort of above our level, and they knew that if we read anything that was disturbing or strange or upset us in any way, we could always talk to them about it. And so it never really felt like we had to hide things from them. But there were a lot of other people who did have to kind of read things in secret. Their parents would say, you can't read Stephen King, here's a Breakfast Club book, and they'd be like, well, I don't want to read that, I want to read Stephen King. And so they would sneak them from the school library and read them in secret. And so there wasn't really a YA category marketed to teens. They existed, the books did exist, but they weren't really marketed to us. And so now, of course, now that I'm an adult and I love adult books, there's all these really great YA books that are coming out that are diverse and interesting and really cool, and they're aimed at teen readers. And so there's so much stuff there that's that's available for them that we didn't have when we were kids. And so I love that teen readers nowadays have books that are specifically for them. And there's a couple really, really good ones that I'm even reading because I just really enjoy how they're written. A good example is Blood at the Root by Ladarian Williams. This is the first in a series. The second one is on its way. But this is sort of it's a magical school. The main character has sort of magic powers that come from ancestral magic that's related to sort of the southern United States black cultures. And there's a mystery at the heart of it. And it's wonderful. Now, this book does have like adult language. It has some sexual content, but it's age appropriate. And there's some drug use, stuff like that. But it's aimed at kids. And it's about sort of struggling to figure out who you are when you're a teenager and you feel like it's your job to do everything for yourself and you have to kind of learn to trust other people. And I'm loving where the series is going, especially the cultural aspects and the magic system, and the main character Malik is great. So this is definitely a fun one and I'm so excited for the next in the series. Another wonderful one is Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. There is a sequel to this coming out fairly soon, but this features a transgender main character. There's sort of like Mexican-American culture, there's magic, it's kind of gothic in a sense, but the main character sort of falls in love with this ghost, and the whole while he recently came out to his family and is trying to sort of make his way as his own person, while everyone else in the family is kind of coming to terms with him and his correct identity and everything. And it's great and it's fantastic. The characters are so wonderful and it's very wholesome, and I cannot wait for the rest of the series. Another wonderful one is Iron Widow by Shirin J. Zhao, and this one is bonkers. It's just like this rage-filled anti-patriarchy fantasy that features, of an interpolation of the story of the first female emperor of China, except there's giant mechas and these are powered by sort of exploiting women, and the main character sort of has had enough. She has been treated badly, her family's been treated badly, and she just sort of seeks to tear down the entire thing and become powerful herself and just fix everything herself. I don't know if it is, but I would love to see it turned into a movie or a TV series or something, because it's just like righteous indignation in book form. It's great. So with that said, I'm going to kind of wrap this up. The big thing to take away from this rambly video is that YA should always be aimed at teenagers. It is for them. It is not really for adults. We can read it, of course, and we can enjoy the characters, but we shouldn't seek to co-opt this category for adult readers. There's plenty of stuff out there for adults to read, plenty of romance and horror and sci-fi and fantasy and all of that. There's plenty of good stuff. Let teenagers have YA and don't insist that it needs to be sort of for adults and feature explicitly adult scenarios, because that's not the point of YA. The point of YA is to give teenagers something that speaks to them about their experiences, whereas we can read YA and say like, oh, I remember what it was like when I was that age and everything felt life and death and everything. But the people who are saying that YA should cater to the needs of adult readers are sort of misunderstanding the value of what YA is. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.